Sir James MacMillan is widely regarded as one of the greatest composers of his generation. Born in 1959 into a working-class family in Ayrshire, Scotland, he felt from a very young age that music was his true vocation, beginning to compose at just 9 years old. In 2019, The Guardian ranked MacMillan's Stabat Mater among the 25 greatest works of classical music of the 21st century. He was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2004 and Knight Bachelor in 2015. In 2022, he composed Who Shall Separate Us?, the anthem written for Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral on the 19th of September. In this fascinating interview for Huxley, Sir James MacMillan reflects on the power of silence, music as revelation, and the meaning of life, exploring how sound, spirit, and purpose intertwine in his art.
It is very nice to meet you, James. My name is Leonid, and this is Narad, who is my singing mentor. I think we'll have a very, very interesting interview today. Narad is himself an opera singer by profession. He hasn't been singing opera for many, many years, but he has been studying choral music and sacred music for the past 60 years.
Mhm.
And he has published a book which he titled The Descent of a New Music, where he spoke about composers and musical compositions that have been written by modern composers in which he feels a touch of higher consciousness. And your name is in that book. And so Narad, I think, believes that you have written some very, very special music. So we're very happy to have you today.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you as well.
It seems to me that you've had maybe dozens or hundreds of interviews and many, many, many articles praising your work.
Well, it seems to, I'm delighted that new music, contemporary music still has a fascination for people in the wider media world, and that people want to know more about what we do as composers.
Well, my first question to you is one that I've asked many others, including your friend Frank Della Rocca.
Mhm.
And it is, of course, a very challenging question. Does music come to you as revelation?
Maybe I'm not the right person to ask about that, but I do get asked questions like this a lot. Just where does the music begin? Is it something internal, or what is there in the external atmosphere, indeed in the cosmos, or in the matter of the soul, that provokes and inspires music? And I think there has to be a balance. I think that one's own artistry, and I think of myself as an artisan, a maker of things, a maker of music, but also as a believer, I'm aware that there's an umbilical link between music and silence, for example, and there's a search for the sacred ongoing, even in modern culture, maybe more so now than ever, amongst modern composers, living composers, who are searching for something that many composers have searched for throughout history. And there's a feeling amongst those who love music, even those who are not conventionally religious, like me, for example, that music is something that looks beyond ourselves to something else. Maybe music is the result of is the result of something more than just the sum of our parts. Is that a spiritual understanding of music? It could be. But when it comes down to it, I do believe there's, as I say, an umbilical connection between what I do as a composer and a sense of the divine, Perhaps music is one of these forms in the arts which opens windows on the nature of the divine.
I have listened to many of your compositions, and a few of them I have found a mystical quality represented. Can you say a little bit about that? This mysticism that comes into music.
Uh, again, it's a tricky question for me to answer, and it's a question that could probably be answered by observers better than I could. But um, throughout musical history, there has been a connection between music and mystery. And it's the very nature of music sometimes that is mysterious, especially to our modern culture, which sometimes finds music a baffling thing because it speaks a language and it has its own meaning that is beyond words and image. And in a culture that is obsessed by the visual and the verbal more than anything else, music can be a strange and mysterious thing. And I think that is the nature of music, that music fills that gap, fills that vacuum with its sense of mystery, its sense of its connection with something divine, and perhaps it's music that allows the divine into the public square, into the public space, that presents such a challenge to the modern secular world, and that's why there sometimes is a sense of bafflement about the mysticism and indeed the mystery of the meaning of music.
Therefore, I would like to ask you, first of all, does music come from the depths of your soul, or what is the mind's function in composition? Or does it have a function?
Oh, I certainly think it does. First of all, the mind has to be engaged by the composer in order to make the deep emotion work well and work at its best abilities. Um, I, I, I do think music is an emotional force and also a religious force, a spiritual art form. But if this religious and emotional and spiritual art form is not controlled by matters of the mind, it it it, uh, it can sometimes fail to communicate its full depth and beauty, and therefore the mind. And I referred to my thinking of myself as an artisan, a maker of music, as well as an artist. It's that artisan's ability to turn emotion and the deep spiritual nature into something that communicates effectively. So a composer has to have his wits about him and indeed a deep intellectual knowledge of how music works, how structures work, how the basic parameters of music can be made to work to a greater power and um, a greater depth.
I have had the great blessing to be near a lady from France who is the greatest being I've ever met. She is known in India, where I live, as the Mother, and she has spoken of a plane of music where one can access any melody, harmony, etc. She says it is a plane where true harmony exists. And we've already read that Brahms would say he could bring down any music from that plane. Do you hear music coming from an ethereal plane?
Yes, and I don't know where that plane is. where it's situated, whether it's in me or around me or outside me or over there or up there. But I think the musical artist has to be searching for something in the ether like that, in an ethereal plane. Um, Even although I emphasize the importance of the intellect in the working of music, that does not negate uh, the reality that music is connected with the other plane, with other planes, perhaps extra human, extra physical planes and states um, that composers have to reach. And we all do that in very different ways. And even when I speak to people who don't share my worldview, and there's a lot of different kind of people who love classical music and who love the music of our time that I meet in my work as a musician, as a composer, as a conductor. I meet them in the concert hall and the theatres. And when you speak to them, even the most skeptical and even the most secular-minded music lover will nevertheless um, agree that there is something deeply spiritual about this art form that we love. And that acknowledgement, that concession, if you like, that music is bigger than the sum of its parts, that it touches something deep within us or something extra to our physical experience is a very important concession. And it means that many music lovers, whether they're believers in God or not, are following parallel lines towards the same state, towards the same goal, in an understanding that music is a spiritual art form and that music has this ability to search for the sacred through its own musical parameters.
Do you ever use a computer in your
No,
composition?
no, I don't.
Very good to hear.
Yeah, I mean the technology has passed me by in many ways, and I can't see how it would help me. I'm old-fashioned in that way. I like using pen and paper and pencil and rulers and erasers and so on, and I write everything by hand. So I don't even use the computer to computer set my music. I wouldn't even know how to begin to do that, to be honest. I'm partly ashamed of that. It's something it's a skill I've never really learned in my adult life, and all my young colleagues and students know exactly how to work with computers, and of course music can be made with the aid of computers, but it's not for me. I'll leave that to others. My only concession to modern technology is that I have an electric pencil sharpener.
Ah. Well, I must say that I'm a throwback also because all my poetry comes in rhyme. What can we do?
Uh-huh.
Uh, Speak to me a little bit about the sacred, equal religiosity versus spirituality versus the mystical. Must be a great aspect for you.
It is, and sometimes I'm asked by people, journalists and people in the wider arts and arts culture, whether I feel isolated in being a religious composer. And I say I don't. I meet many religious composers of different types. But then when you look at modernity, and I suppose the implication in those questions is simply that this is the modern world and religion is supposed to have been finished with. We're supposed to have put these old-fashioned ideas like religious belief behind us. And there are many aspects of culture that have moved away from the search for the sacred or the search for the spiritual and so on. But music could never do that because there's something innate about the nature of music, which is spiritual and indeed searching for the sacred. And to make my point, I point to modernity itself. I point to the history of, let's say, Western music, whether it be in Europe or other parts of the world throughout the last century or so. And what we see there is a series of major composers throughout the last 100 years and more who have been profoundly religious men and women. And I point to the likes of Stravinsky, for example, who set the Mass, who set the Psalms, who set
Yes.
little prayers, and was a deeply religious man. And then I point to that other great polar opposite of early modernism, Arnold Schoenberg, who reconverted reconverted to a practicing Judaism when he left Germany in the 1930s. And his later music is infused with Jewish culture, the Jewish spirit, the Jewish theology. Um, and then on we go through the 20th century. When we come to the end of the Second World War, the figures who emerged like Olivier Messiaen, who was profoundly Catholic in every piece he
Yes.
wrote.
Yes.
Francis Poulenc as well. And Messiaen was the teacher of Boulez and Stockhausen, and there's a deep spiritual element in the work of certainly Stockhausen. It's quite an eccentric spirituality, I suppose, but it is there. And then coming forward again, if you look at all those composers who emerged from behind what was known as the Iron Curtain after Shostakovich, all of them were profoundly religious men and women. I'm thinking of the likes of Alfred Schnittke and Sofia Gubaidulina,
Oh, yes.
Galina Ustvolskaya, Arvo Pärt, Gea Cancelli.
Could you tell me a little bit about your work on love?
The piece for voice and
Yes.
well, yes, that's quite an old piece now. I wrote it for a friend's wedding many years ago, maybe even 40 years ago now, and it's a setting of a poem by a poet you probably know a lot about, um, um, an Indian mystic, and it's been recorded and performed sometimes by a solo singer and organ, and sometimes it could be sung just by a soprano section, by a choral section. But it was an exploration of a more mystical text for me, a text I remember that seemed to bridge the gap between the East and West. And that's sometimes a very rich theme for artists to explore, as I'm sure you're aware.
Was it from Tagore?
Yes. Yep.
I'm sorry, yes. Of course, could you comment on Goretsky and Taverner also?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Goretsky is another of these composers who emerged from behind the Iron Curtain, like the others, and changed his style and went in a very different direction, and greatly moving and powerful, beautiful music emerged from that scene. And sometimes he's connected with, in the public's mind, at least with John Tavener, who also, as you're probably aware, very interested in orthodoxy, Russian and Greek orthodoxy, and that experience shaped his sound world. And there's a deep liturgical, ritualistic mysticism about both of them, but in different ways. I think Goretsky, you could say, you could feel that kind of Polish Catholicism very much at work in his choral music especially, but also in his famous Third Symphony. And with Tavener, it was the discovery of the religions of the East, in particular Orthodoxy, that seemed to change his style and aesthetic and move it in a very different way. I've conducted both their music, and I did some of John Tavernier's music quite recently, and Gorecki's music a little before, both with the BBC singers in the United Kingdom. And it's a very rich and glorious sound world that they both explore.
What about your sacred compositions for the common man? You've written about that before.
Do you mean the music to be performed by amateurs?
No, music for the common man, for
Right.
for the ordinary choir, for the church choir, etc.
Yes. Well, I mean, I've always enjoyed writing choral music, but when I was younger, I was being invited by probably some of the greatest choirs in the world to write for them. So when you're asked by the BBC singers or Westminster Abbey or Westminster Cathedral to write for them, you tend to write up to their strengths. So I was writing music that was quite complex and needed virtuosic ability in order to deliver it, to perform it. But then I became aware that there was a growing interest in my music from ordinary amateur church choirs and secular choirs that were finding some of that music, earlier music, a little difficult because it was written for the top performers. So I made a decision that I needed to build a body of work that was practical and achievable by people who were not the BBC singers or uh, King's College, Cambridge. So I set about writing works that were deliberately shaped and structured so that good amateur choirs could sing it. And I've made that a priority in my choral writing ever since. There's a set of works called the Strathclyde Motets that I wrote for a very ordinary but very good college choir. And I learned a lot about how to write for the ordinary man and woman who wants to sing choral music. And it's very important that composers keep in touch with their roots and maintain connections with the wider musical ecology. And that musical ecology involves a lot of non-specialist volunteers, amateurs who sing and play in their local communities. Composers, I think people at Benjamin Britten and other British composers said this, that composers should be useful for their community. And I hope that that might be the case with me too.
I would like to ask you about your feeling of Elgar's dream of Gerontius versus his Nimrod.
Yes. Well, I mean, Elgar's a fascinating figure. I think that The Dream of Gerontius is a masterpiece. And he wrote it. It came from a very specific place in his soul. And it wouldn't have been the same kind of music if it hadn't been for his own religious and spiritual orientation, which was Catholic. He was an English Catholic, growing up and working at a time in England when it was not easy to be a Catholic. You know, it was Catholics were barred from Oxford and Cambridge universities for a while, and um, the Catholic community in England and in Scotland here were suspicious. People were suspicious of them. It's because of the hangover from the Reformation and so on. And so when he produced The Dream of Gerontius, it took immense courage for him to write a profoundly Catholic work full of Catholic sensibilities at a time when Catholicism was not very popular in England. And the fact that he did that showed the depth of his inspiration. Now, subsequently, as we know that Elgar lost his faith. A lot is made of that. He drifted away from the church. He drifted away from belief. But I think it was because his secular music, his more popular secular music, like Nimrod, as you mentioned, like the Enigma variations, made him
Yes.
very popular in the wider British culture. He became a totem for English nationalism. He became the quintessentially British composer. I think he was seduced by that, and it helped make him drift away from his Catholic core. But we will never lose the fact that the Dream of Gerontius, his true one of many masterpieces, perhaps his greatest work, was made because of his Catholic background.
May I ask you your evaluation of Samuel Barber's major works?
Uh, I I don't know many of them, but I've always been moved and impressed by anything. I've listened to the violin concerto, the orchestral pieces, the choral music. He's a true American master, and the American musical world is rightly proud of him, and many of the other great 20th century composers that country produced. But he's a great American great.
A question on how you merge poetic text into your compositions.
I've always valued the relationship between music and text, and I've always been looking for words to set to music. And sometimes those words have been given to me by living poets. I have a very close relationship with an English poet called Michael Simmons Roberts, who has written libretti for me and poems especially for musical setting. And in more recent years, I've developed another good, strong relationship with an American poet, Dana Gioia,
Oh, yeah.
who Frank LaRocca will know.
Yeah.
And Dana and I produced a big work a few years ago, Fiat Lux, Let There Be Light, which was a beautiful poem by Dana, which referenced biblical sources as well. So I value the relationships I have with poets, whether they're living or dead, and I certainly still scouring the treasury of English poetry, in particular, always looking for new text to set.
Wonderful. There's, of course, the minimalist composers. Is there any future direction for them?
Well, there's a number of different kinds of minimalism that have emerged over the years, and they've all had an impact generally on the wider musical culture, even on those like me who would not describe themselves as minimalist. But on one level, there's the American minimalists like Philip Glass,
Yes.
Steve Reich, and
Yes.
others. And Steve Reich's music is deeply spiritual. He's a Jewish composer, and he draws deeply from that well of Jewish heritage. And there's some deeply religious works in his catalogue. Then there's a European minimalism. The major minimalist voice in Western Europe was Louis Andriessen from Holland, who was a very muscular, streetwise music. You could feel the influence of jazz and pop music and so on. And then you've probably heard the term holy minimalism. It's a pejorative term, I suppose, but and we've mentioned a few of them already. Composers like Tavener, John Tavener, and Arvo Pärt, who use a minimal amount of material to create these wonderful, visionary musical canvases, all of which are deeply rooted in a religious and indeed liturgical heritage. So there's different kinds of minimalism, and they achieve different things. But I think amongst those composers I've mentioned, there's a legacy there that will linger on and perhaps influence composers of the future in very different and unexpected ways in the future. But who knows?
What about Peter's Vasts?
Beautiful music. I like his music very much, and many of those composers from Eastern Europe, you can feel the deep influence of the choral tradition in the Baltic states, for example. And even recently, I was listening to Schnutke's Concerto for Choir, and you can feel the 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 deep legacy of Russian Orthodox choral music in that. And Vasks is one of these composers. You can feel the legacy of history and indeed liturgy and religious ritual deep at the heart of his music.
Eric's Essenvals.
Again, equally shaped by history and tradition, and perhaps that's what the world needs now. Certainly in the wake of the sometimes nihilistic expressions in culture that came about in modernism, that those composers and other artists who are not afraid of tradition and in some sense want to embrace a sense of the deep past to make it part of their modern music. It's a very interesting way to go. Another composer, since we're with Leonid just now, Ukrainian, is the great composer Silvestrov, and we can hear the deep past in his work as well.
Yes. It seems that the Baltic states have produced quite a few composers. Eric's Essenvals.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I love going there. I go to Estonia a lot, and I work there with the Estonian Philharmonic Chamber Choir, but also the orchestra, the Philharmonic Orchestra, and the Tallinn Chamber Orchestra is another favourite of mine. And I meet composers over there all the time who, of course, revere Arvo Pärt and the older composers, but it's quite clear that the tradition is living on in the new generation of younger composers emerging in these countries.
Can you speak a little bit about your Magnificat and Noctamitis?
Yes. Well, I was asked to write these pieces at the turn of the millennium, and there are two different versions of each piece. There's a usable compact version for choir and organ of both, and then there's orchestral versions of both. The settings are of the English translation of the canticles, and they're used a lot in Anglican worship. They're used for evensong services in big Anglican cathedrals, Church of England cathedrals in the United Kingdom. So they're very liturgical works. They're written specifically for liturgy. They seem to work for liturgy. But they also work in the concert hall as well. I've heard the music performed by choirs and orchestras in concert halls. And the Magnificat, the style of the choral music is actually very simple. It's mostly quite homophonic, chordal, and it can be delivered by good amateur choirs, like we were saying earlier. The style and aesthetic of the Nunc Dimittis is a little bit more difficult, and it needs real professional singers to do it.
I've been very, very moved by Rachmaninoff's Vespers.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to me to be one of the great compositions, spiritual compositions of all time. How do you feel?
Yes, I would agree with that. It's a profound work, a timeless piece, but it begins it begins in a very specific place in time and in culture. It would not have been the music that it is if it hadn't been for his Russian soul and his Orthodox soul. And he drew deeply from those experiences, those identities, if you like. And perhaps that's a lesson to us all, that we need to sometimes look inwardly to see what it is that made us the people we are. And when I look inwardly, I can see where I'm from. You can probably hear in my accent, I'm Scottish. My Scottish heritage is important to me. My Catholic heritage is probably very important to me too, so that the experience of the Catholic world, the Catholic liturgy, the Catholic prayers are vital to me in finding the authenticity that I mentioned earlier.
Does it often expand to other religions?
Well, yes. I think we live in a very pluralist world where we, even those of us who want to remain rooted in who we are and what we are, we still need to be able to enter into a constant cultural dialogue with those of us, with those who are different. And sometimes that means knowing and listening to others from different cultures, and being as open and informed as to the wealth of musical and spiritual cultures around the world. And within the Christian tradition, that means someone that like me would look at the Orthodox or Byzantine experience, but also the Protestant experience and the whole experience of Lutheran chorales that produced one of the great composers, J.S. Bach. And sometimes it means maybe looking even beyond that. When I was a student at the University of Durham in England, the person I shared my apartment with was from Java in Indonesia. And the house was full of these wonderful instruments from Java, genders and sulings and metallophones and wooden flutes. And that was a huge learning experience for me.
I have one last question, and I remember Otto Schnabel saying, I play the same notes, but it's the silence in between. Can you speak on the silence?
Well, yes. I mean, there is an umbilical, again, this word umbilical link between music and silence. Composers know that the music they make, the music they seek, exists and begins in that silent place. It wasn't just John Cage who was onto something here. It's in the silence of one's own hearts and souls that composers paradoxically find sound that they then craft into their own compositions. So the silence, metaphorical, sometimes literal silence, that one can encounter, and especially now I live in a very quiet place now. I moved away from the city. I live in the back of beyond in Scotland. It's very conducive to work, and I know that the silence here, as well as the silence in my own heart and mind, has a lot to do with that.
Well, there's this great composer who lives in Washington on an island, and he's composed many, many wonderful pieces.
Mm-hmm.
His name escapes me for the moment. But I want to say that you have enriched our experience and our understanding of music that comes through you. And in India, we bow like this, which means I bow to the divinity in you. Thank you, James.
That's very kind, much appreciated, and thank you so much for your questions. I visited India once, and it was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life.
James, would you have time for a couple of more questions from my side?
Yes, on you
Yes.
go.
I fell in love with your piece, Miserere, and it was such a moving experience listening to that piece. Can you share the story behind it, how it came to you?
Mm. Yes, it came about as a companion piece. It was a commission from the 16, which is this wonderful British choir that I have a good relationship with. And they wanted a companion piece for the Allegri Miserere some years ago. And writing companion pieces can be a double-edged sword sometimes, because usually the piece that you're writing to companion is a very famous work and known very well in musical circles and and in the musical world. And of course, everyone knows the Allegri Miserere and the famous story about it, about Mozart going to the Sistine Chapel and dictating it and so on. But it has this incredible enchanting quality, the way that the chant is enmeshed with the polyphony and so on. So I needed to, I remember thinking I need to write something which makes a kind of acknowledgement towards the original, but allows the music to go off into my own direction. So the music, you can hear the remnants of Gregorian chant in my Miserere. But I think there are other things there too, the harmonies of the modern world, perhaps, um, and there's something of my Scottish accent in that music as well. It has a kind of Celtic flavour or atmosphere to the music.
Especially in the ending, I somehow the ending is really powerful in that piece, I feel. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, I actually wanted also to ask you something like a really grand question about the future of humanity or life on Earth. Uh, I know you're a Catholic, and perhaps your views may be influenced by the tradition, but what is your perspective on where humanity is headed? Do you think there is some kind of spiritual evolution happening in the world today, or are we like going back, or what is really happening in the world? Where are we headed?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't look into the future, but I remain positive that even in these difficult times, um, the Holy Spirit, if I can use a Catholic reference, is at work. And it's usually the case that the Holy Spirit and God Himself can be at work sometimes in the deepest abysses of human experience. Many people would ask at the time, where was God in Auschwitz? And then even in the wake of that, Adorno said that no poetry was possible. It was impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz. And one can understand the nihilism and despair that provoked those reactions. However, sometimes it's in the very abyss, and there have been terrible abysses in the 20th century that have disfigured our human experience, and man has fallen to very low bestial levels in the Holocaust and in the Third Reich and um, in what the communists and the fascists have done and so on. But through all those terrible times, mankind still created music, for example. Um, the evil men of the world did not silence the desire to make music. And that desire to make music points to a desire for humanity to go on, to continue, to have a future, and that we can leave a legacy for the future. So even when things can be very dark, and sometimes things are very dark, and as a Ukrainian, you know that. But look at what's happening in your country or in your community. People are still making music and looking with hope to the future when peace will return and man can turn the tide again towards something good.
Mm. And what is the meaning of life to you? How do you see maybe your meaning or meaning as a whole or of human life?
Uh, I think we're here on earth to praise God, to be honest. I know there'll be a lot of skepticism about that, and it seems a kind of worthless aim or activity, but actually that's what music's all about. There's something kind of very unpractical about music and the arts. It doesn't, the great uh, technicians, technocrats of the world look at music and the arts and are bewildered by them because they don't see any practical worth in them. But it's that complete lack of practicality that points to something even more important. It points to our spiritual being, our spiritual essence. And if music is here to serve God, then maybe life on earth is here for that purpose as well, to be in continual search for a reconnection with our divine source and divine maker.
As a student of philosophy, I completely agree with you. I think that there is something very valuable in things that are not very practical from the ordinary point of view.
Hmm.
But
So I would like to keep in touch with you, sir.
Yes, please let's
Maybe
do
I could
that.
send you a couple of pieces of composers you haven't heard.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I will share that. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful.
It
Very
was
nice to meet you
wonderful.
both, gentlemen.
Yes. All the best to you.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.